14-year-old Aki wakes before the sun has fully risen. The morning air is cool, and the smell of wood smoke drifts through his family's home. Outside, his village is already coming to life. Hunters quietly prepare their bows before disappearing into the forest. Women tend to cooking fires as breakfast begins to simmer. Children race between the homes, laughing without a care in the world, while elders gather to discuss the coming harvest and share stories passed down through countless generations. For Aki, this is simply another ordinary morning. He has never heard the words America or United States. Those names do not exist. He doesn't know that one day this land will be covered by highways, towering skyscrapers, busy airports and cities filled with millions of people. He cannot imagine a place called New York, Washington, Chicago, or Los Angeles, because none of them have been built. His world is already complete. If you asked Aki who owned this land, he probably wouldn't understand the question. How could anyone own the river that gave his family water every day, or the forest where his father hunted, or the mountains where his ancestors had lived for generations beyond memory? To him, the land was never something to own. It was something to respect. Now, let's leave Aki's world for just a moment and return to our own. Look around you. Every street, every bridge, every airport, every farm, every city, every power line, every landmark that makes America what it is today. Now, picture all of it disappearing. The White House is gone. The Statue of Liberty is gone. New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Dallas. Every town and every road vanish as though they had never existed. Now ask yourself one simple question. Who does this land belong to? Most people would answer with one word: America. Today, that answer makes perfect sense. But for almost all of human history, there was no country called the United States. In fact, there wasn't even a single nation that ruled this land. Instead, this continent was home to hundreds of nations, each with its own language, customs, beliefs, laws, and traditions. They weren't one people. They weren't one culture. They were as different from one another as England was from Italy, or Japan was from Egypt. This isn't simply the history of Native Americans, and it isn't simply the history of the United States. It's the story of how one became deeply connected to the other. It's a story of remarkable civilizations, extraordinary discoveries, friendship, trade, conflict, resilience, and survival. Most importantly, it's the story of how one of the youngest countries on Earth came to exist on a land that had already been home to countless generations of people. To understand that story, we have to journey further back than almost anyone expects. Not hundreds of years, not thousands, but tens of thousands of years. Long before Aki's people built their village, before his ancestors learned the stories he would one day hear around the fire, before there were forests filled with familiar trails or rivers with familiar names, the world looked very different. Towering walls of ice covered much of North America. Winters were harsher than anything we know today, and so much of the Earth's water was locked inside enormous glaciers. That sea levels dropped dramatically. Entire coastlines looked nothing like they do now. Between what we know today as Siberia and Alaska stretched a vast expanse of land called Beringia. Calling it a land bridge doesn't quite capture what it really was. This wasn't a narrow strip of land that people hurried across. In some places, it stretched for hundreds of miles. It was a cold but thriving landscape where mammoths, bison, horses, and countless other animals roamed in search of food. For thousands of years, it connected to continents that are now separated by the Bering Sea. At some point, human beings made that journey too. Exactly when they arrived, how many groups crossed, and whether some traveled along the Pacific coastline by boat instead of on foot are questions that scientists are still working to answer. The story is still unfolding as new discoveries are made. For much of the 20th century, however, historians believe they already had the answer. It became known as the Clovis First theory. According to this idea, The first people arrived in North America around 13,000 years ago. As the great ice sheets slowly retreated, they crossed Beringia and traveled south through an opening between the glaciers, eventually spreading across the continent. The theory wasn't invented out of thin air. Archaeologists had discovered beautifully crafted stone spear points across large parts of North America. These tools, now known as Clovis points, dated back roughly 13,000 years and showed clear evidence of a widespread and highly skilled culture. For decades, the Clovis first theory appeared to explain everything. Then history surprised everyone. As archaeologists uncovered older campsites and improved dating technology, they began finding evidence that simply didn't fit the timeline. Some sites suggested that people had reached the Americas even earlier than the Clovis culture. Today, most archaeologists agree that the Clovis people were not the first known inhabitants. They were real, and they were remarkably skilled, but they were part of a much longer human story that had already begun thousands of years before. Exactly how much earlier that story began is still being investigated. Some discoveries point to human occupation more than 16,000 years ago. Others suggest it may stretch back even further. Researchers continue comparing archaeological evidence, ancient DNA, geological records, and indigenous oral traditions in search of clearer answers. That uncertainty isn't a weakness. It's one of the greatest strengths of science. History isn't written once and forgotten forever. Every discovery has the power to reshape what we think we know. The goal isn't to defend old ideas. It's to follow the evidence wherever it leads. What we do know with confidence is this. Long before Christopher Columbus looked west across the Atlantic, long before the English language was spoken on this continent, long before there was a country called the United States, people were already here. They raised children. They buried their loved ones. They hunted, farmed, traded, created art, solved problems, and built communities that lasted for countless generations. Over thousands of years, those communities grew into hundreds of distinct nations, each shaped by the land around them and by the people who called it home. By the time Aki opened his eyes on that ordinary morning, his world was already the result of thousands of years of history. Neither he nor anyone in his village could have imagined that, far beyond the horizon, another world was slowly moving toward theirs. When those two worlds finally met, the history of this continent would change forever. If someone had sailed over North America in the year 1400, they probably would have seen endless forests stretching beyond the horizon, towering mountain ranges, winding rivers, and vast open grasslands. From that height, it might have looked like untouched wilderness. For centuries, many Europeans believed exactly that. When they later wrote about these lands, they often described them as empty, wild, and waiting to be civilized. But history tells a very different story. The forests were not empty. The plains were not unclaimed, and this continent was anything but untouched. Long before Europeans arrived, millions of people already called this land home. They had spent thousands of years shaping the world around them. They farmed fertile valleys, managed forests with carefully controlled fires, built irrigation systems where water was scarce, and established trade routes that stretched farther than most people would imagine. North America wasn't waiting for civilization. It already had civilizations. This is where many people make their first mistake. They hear the words Native Americans and picture a single people living the same way across the entire continent. That couldn't be further from the truth. Imagine visiting Europe in the year 1400. Would you expect someone living in England to speak the same language as someone in Italy? Would they worship the same way, follow the same laws, build the same homes, eat the same food? North America was home to hundreds of nations, each with its own language, culture, traditions, and understanding of the world. Some lived among frozen northern landscapes where survival depended on mastering the harshest climates on Earth. Others made their homes in scorching deserts where every drop of water mattered. Some settled beside mighty rivers that flooded with life each year. Others crossed open plains that stretched farther than the eye could see. The land shaped their lives, and in return they learned how to live with the land. No single nation represented them all. Every community had its own story, its own leaders, its own beliefs, its own way of life. Centuries before Aki was born, one of those stories gave rise to a city that would surprise almost anyone hearing about it today. Its name was Cahokia. Around the 11th and 12th centuries, Cahokia grew into the largest known city north of what is now Mexico. Historians estimate that between 10,000 and 20,000 people lived there, with thousands more spread across the surrounding communities. At a time when many European cities were still relatively small, Cahokia was already a thriving urban center filled with homes, marketplaces, ceremonial spaces, and neighborhoods connected by carefully planned roads. At the heart of the city stood an enormous earthen monument now known as Monk's Mound. Even today, it rises nearly 100 feet above the surrounding landscape. Now, stop for a moment and think about that. No cranes, no bulldozers, no engines. Just people. For years, they carried basket after basket of earth, working together until they created one of the largest man-made structures in North America. That kind of achievement doesn't happen by accident. It takes planning, leadership, engineering, mila, and thousands of people working toward a common goal. Cahokia was also connected to a remarkable trading network. Shells arrived from the Gulf Coast. Copper came from the Great Lakes. Stone traveled from distant mountains, hundreds, sometimes even thousands of miles away. Ideas traveled with those goods. So did traditions. So did knowledge. This wasn't an isolated settlement hidden in the wilderness. It was part of a continent connected by trade, communication, and human ambition. Then, almost as mysteriously as it rose, Cahokia began to disappear. By around the year 1350, much of the city had been abandoned. For generations, historians searched for one simple explanation. The truth is more complicated. Most researchers now believe there was probably no single cause. Environmental changes, repeated flooding, pressure on natural resources, political instability, and other challenges may have combined. Over time, until people gradually left the city, we still don't know exactly what happened. And that's okay. One of the most important lessons history teaches us is that not every mystery has been solved. Sometimes the most honest answer is simply, we're still learning. Aki had no reason to fear the horizon. To him, another ordinary day was coming to an end. Across an ocean he never knew existed, another man believed he was about to discover a new world. Neither of them could see the other. Neither of them knew that history was about to change forever. The story of America didn't begin with a country. It began with people, families, dreams, and generations whose voices still echo across this land today. If this documentary taught you something new, consider liking the video and subscribing. Your support helps keep these stories alive and allows us to uncover many more that history still has to tell. Until next time, thank you for watching.